Welcome to the missing link in dog training, how your dog's body is affecting their behaviors. This is dog training from the inside out with holistic dog trainer, Allecia Evans. I'm Allecia Evans. My clients lovingly refer to me as the animal healer. I'm part Dr. Doolittle animal communicator, part holistic dog trainer, medical intuitive, energy healer, and I have combined those 4 elements into my animal healer title because I work with bodies and behaviors and emotions and energies as well as health. I have a background in canine and equine massage. I am a canine nutrition expert. For the last 22 years, I've been doing diets for dogs and cooking home foods and preparing raw meals and getting them the proper supplementation, not only to help their health issues, but also to help shift their behaviors. I'm the inventor of the Walk-in Sync Humane Dog Walking and Training System. I am a 22-year Qigong practitioner, an elite level fitness trainer before I got into my lovely venture with the dogs. I'm a biomechanics expert for both humans and animals. I am an author, an award-winning TV show host, a radio host, an online course creator, and a workshop presenter. And what I'm going to share with you is a couple of discoveries that I made over the last 22 years working with animals and learning directly from them and learning directly from their bodies. And I'll take you through this presentation, but just understand this presentation is really my journey through connecting a lot of different dots to what I was hearing about dog behavior, but then what I started understanding about this missing link that was taking place that not a lot of people were talking about, in why sometimes the body is really at the root of a lot of animal behaviors and also their health. So when I started training with dogs, not as a professional, but just as a dog parent, basically I was told, you need to exercise your dog. And you can see exercise can drain off a lot of energy from a very overly excited pup. And it's useful. We can teach our dogs to fetch, we can teach our dogs to play frisbee, we can teach our dogs to hike with us and, let them run around at the dog park. But when you land up having a dog that, you can't really drain their energy and they can't walk well on leash, then a problem comes up because you don't know how to optimally exercise them. You don't know how to, help them balance their energy of excitement and learn to get calm and relaxed. Now, this was the case with my chocolate lab Barney. So on the left, you can see that 26 years ago, I had got one of the cutest puppies on the planet. And I was so in love. And all I visioned was Barney and I having this amazing relationship, walking down the street with ease, walking down the street and he's right next to me and people are looking at us and they're saying, wow, how did you develop such a great relationship with this puppy? And then Barney grew up. But during our training, we experienced a lot of issues that left me heartbroken and pretty devastated, and left Barney, I'm sure, pretty frustrated with me. So this is really it's a presentation, but it is my journey through my work with Barney that brought me to understanding this connection with the missing link between the body-mind connection in dogs. So I will take you through this, and I hope that it's informative, and I hope it speaks to you as well if you have been experiencing any challenging issues with your dog, that you can get through it. And I'm here to help you actually get to the other side of it, because I've experienced this myself and I know how to shift it in an easy, natural, healthy way. So in the beginning, as the picture on the left, Barney was the cutest little puppy, and we went to dog training class. When Barney came into dog training class, we had the collar in the middle, the flat collar, which Barney was always pulling on. When we went to class, we were told to bring a choke chain, because back 26 years ago, that's literally, how training went. It really wasn't treat-based at all. To tell you the truth, I had the fear of God put into me that if I gave my dog a treat, I would probably get struck down by lightning. And I didn't feel comfortable about it, but this was recommended by the professional trainers. And I really, at the time, I didn't know about any of this, but I really wanted to do the right thing for my dog. Well, the first time that I had Barney on a choke chain, we were walking around class and he started pulling a little bit and the trainer recommended to pop the leash. I'll never forget the way Barney looked at me. He was sort of like, "What are you doing, you crazy woman? Why did that just happen?" And I could feel it in the pit of my stomach that it wasn't right. But there we were in the middle of class, and honestly, I didn't know what else to do. So that's how we kind of started our formal training relationship. And I take full responsibility for not feeling right about it, but not knowing what else to do. Well, what I realized was that the choke chain really wasn't helping. So the next apparatus that we were told to get was the nose halter. And what Barney, acted like when he was on that was an insane being. I mean, he hated it. He was constantly trying to scratch it off his nose. One day when he hooked his paw on the halter on the nose and he pushed it down while simultaneously pulling up like a bucking bronco. And 2 days later, I went to touch his neck and he screamed. And I had to take him to the veterinarian, who also happened to be a chiropractor. And he said, your dog knocked 3 vertebrae out in his neck. And I thought, oh my God, we're not doing too well here. The choke chain isn't working. The nose halter isn't working. So I went back to the professional trainer. I said, what do we do next? They said, well, now you do a prong collar. I wasn't crazy about it, but I was willing to try it, put it on Barney. The dog froze. I mean, he looked at me with terror in his eyes. He's like, he didn't even want to step forward. He sort of started slinking forward. And it was, it was very, very difficult because you can't pull on it and you want to get your dog to go forward. And like I said, at that time, we weren't using treats. So he had it on for a few days. One day we were at the dog park and a dog came rushing up to him. They kind of got into an altercation. And when I went to go grab both dogs' collars, my finger got caught in the prong collar. I almost broke my knuckle. So there went the prong collar. We were told we could try a harness, but in all likelihood, it would keep Barney pulling, which it actually did, because when the harness clips at the back, your dog is actually going to be able to push into their front legs, which activates their instincts. And so that wasn't working either, because Barney was still able to pull me down the street. Then we went to, the last recommendation was for a shock collar, and I was against the shock collar. I just literally didn't know what else to do because there really wasn't positive reinforcement training at the time. So I tried the shock collar out on my ex-husband, and he was able to feel the shock, but it was not too bad. And then I tried it on Barney, and I hit the shocker once, and I heard that dog scream and jump, and I felt horrible because I would never, ever want to cause that dog pain. And that was it. Shock collar went in the garbage. Now I was stuck, and I went back to the choke chain. So one day, after a year and a half of Barney probably thinking his name was Barney, no, I got so angry at being pulled around, I yanked on the choke chain really hard. And I heard Barney yelp, and I basically collapsed on the sidewalk and started hysterical crying. And what I realized in that moment was there's got to be a better way. Like, there's got to be a better way to be able to walk and train my dog that does not hurt him, that respects his body, that we both enjoy, and that we both understand. So in that moment of feeling like such a failure to him and for myself, I made him a promise that one day I would create a way for dogs to walk in sync with their humans, for dogs' bodies to be respected, and for the communication to be vastly improved, so that walking in sync was an easy option for both dog and human. And Barney was really kind of my Marley. You know, there were just so many lessons that dog taught me. So finally, after 2.5 years, we did find someone who was at the beginning stages of behavioral training using treats. And I realized that Barney had bionic hearing when it came to food. So that was great because it resolved certain things. But after about 6 months, he went back to pulling on the leash. And I think it was to actually teach me some different lessons about what I would eventually understand about the body-mind connection in dogs. So, you know, when Barney and I went back to the choke chain and I had that choke chain incident with him, I mean, this is funny and it's not so funny. It's like, I'm afraid the choke chain worked too well, dear. You know, no one ever wants to hurt their dog. And I think on an instinctual level, we all know that putting something around the throat is not the safest or healthiest thing. Like, seriously, would you do this to your kid? This is my son, my girlfriend's son, and he was willing to pose for this picture because it really just illustrates the point. Like, why wouldn't you do it to your kid? Because instinctually, you know, well, there's things in their throat and they can get hurt. So why are we still doing this with our dogs? So there's 10 commandments, and I really feel like there should actually be an 11th commandment for people with dogs, that thou shalt not pull. And I think as dog parents, we'd all love for that to happen, but we realize there's certain reasons why they do. What this journey took me on was a really deep understanding of biomechanics of a dog. So literally how a dog's body moves in space and time. Also the physiology of a dog, which we're going to get to next, like what actually takes place in the dog's system that we need to be aware of, because when we potentially damage certain things in the body, it can create behavior issues and it can also create health issues. Now, for this picture in particular, this is probably what I looked like when I was walking down the road with my dog Tucson. But you can see here that the tension being created by the person, you know, holding on to the dog trying to pull, it's pulling the dog's neck out of alignment. It's literally pulling it backwards. And what the dog has to do is then kind of try to keep pulling to get their feet staying on the floor. So we're going to look at the tools of training. We're going to look at what's actually going on in your dog's body and their physiology. And we're going to look at a way to make things much simpler so you and your dog can be walking in sync and you can avoid the pitfalls of a lot of what happens with dog behaviors, because no one's looking at this missing link of the mind-body connection. So this is a pretty good illustration of the opposition reflex. The dog's pulling, the human's pulling back. They're in opposite directions. What we don't realize from the dog's perspective is that if the dog's getting pulled backwards because they're straining on the leash and their feet come off the floor, they do not have a choice but to push forward more to try and keep their front feet on the floor. So this is not just an issue of you know, a dog being stubborn. This is actually a physiological issue of a dog literally trying to stand upright. Now, as humans, we sit there and say, well, then the dog should just stop pulling on leash. And that's not exactly the way it works, because what I'll share with you that I eventually discovered was a dog has a natural collection point for being on the ground and having all four paws down on the ground and being comfortable. They have a collection point for where, when they feel a little bit of pressure, they'll start to come off of it. Unfortunately, though, the neck and the nose are not the proper places for them, for that collection point. But I will show you later in the presentation what that collection point actually is. So in my journey with Barney, what started to happen was I started connecting the dots, or I started connecting the dog. And as a result of my background in traditional Chinese medicine and in fitness training and physiology for humans, and then in canine and equine massage and understanding animals' physiology, I started to ask some new questions. And those new questions that I was asking started to actually create some new awarenesses about what was really taking place at the root of so many behavior issues. So I started looking at more closely. I started looking at, so what's going on the inside of a dog? Because most of us, when we're working with our dog, we're looking at the outside of the dog, we're looking at the training tools, but not many of us actually have a deep understanding or even an awareness of the actual physiology that's happening, that is literally physically how your dog is made up, and how that physiology can actually get injured, or how that physiology being off balance could create behavior issues. So even though you see the outside of your dog, these are the bones that make up the inside of your dog, okay? And if we just look at the cervical vertebrae area, the neck, those bones, while they're tucked inside, you know, between the throat and the neck, those are some pretty delicate bones that also have some, they all have nerves innervating the spine, those little circles, the holes that you see in the spine on the side. The nerves pass through there. Now, interesting where we put our collars, right? Because we could actually have an injury, or we could throw a vertebrae out of alignment and might not notice it for a while. And that actually could be the root of our dog's behavior issue. So we're going to get a little more in depth now about what is really taking place on the inside of your dog. So this is a picture of the energy field of a dog. And so for many of you who are taking yoga or who understand about the chakra system, you can see from the dog on the right where the chakras are located in the body. From the larger picture, all I want you to understand is that your dog has a system of energy that's flowing through it that makes everything literally run. Like it makes the heart beat, it makes the lungs function, it makes the stomach digest, it makes the kidneys, you know, flush out, the kidneys in the urinary bladder flush out urine when it needs to. It makes the liver function. So while we're dealing with the outside of the dog's body for the most part, just understand that there's an interconnective energy field in which your dog functions, and that energy field really relies on the clear, on a clear system. When I say a clear system, not just the organs, but think about even the bones, because the bones in the back of the spine, because the nerves innervate them and those nerves are connected to the organs, if anything happens in the spine, it's actually going to affect those organs, and it can affect behavior because the whole system is a connected field of energy. Now, let's take a look at your dog's bones for a moment, okay? So we have the mandible, which is the head, and then we have the atlas, so that's right at the base of the skull. Then we have the cervical vertebrae, which sit between the neck and the throat. The cervical vertebrae land up handling a lot of pressure for a very small area. The bones in this picture look big, but the cervical vertebrae are some of the smallest vertebrae that, like as humans, that we have in our neck and that the animals have in their neck. So if you look at typically where the collar would go or where a nose halter would go, you can see we can easily be doing damage in here. But because we can't see it, and because our dog's not reacting like they're hurt, most often they're reacting like they want to pull more, and we get frustrated, we're not seeing the little things that can happen. So if you look up at the atlas for a second, the atlas is at the base of the skull, and it also, C1, the very next vertebrae down, innervates the atlas. Now, one of the things I discovered early on about puppies was the first direction a puppy will usually pull when they put a collar on is at the base of the neck. So when your puppy goes to pull at the base of the neck and that collar is at the base of their neck, depending on which way they jerk around, they can knock their C1 vertebrae out of whack, which is attached to the atlas. And if C1 is off balance, it can actually press on a nerve that starts compromising the blood flow to the brain. So just from a common sense standpoint, I mean, I'm laying down the physical science for you, but just from a common sense standpoint, I started to realize, I was like, it does not make sense to put a collar on a puppy first because of the way they generally react. They could already be putting something out at the base of their skull, and we might not realize it for a while till there's a much bigger problem. But it could be creating an energy flow problem in the dog's body, which can absolutely affect their behavior. I hope that makes sense. So the next thing that we're going to look at is also the trachea. Okay, we've got the larynx up in here, and then we've got the trachea that comes down here. Same physiology in humans as it is in the dogs, just a different positioning. Now, think about most of the time where your collar is, okay, or where it's pressing. The problem here too is that cartilage is like a cardboard box. As long as it's not tampered with, it's strong. But you know, as soon as a cardboard box bends or it's got too much humidity, kind of starts collapsing. Well, the thing with the trachea is cartilage is firm enough, but if you damage it, it starts to harden and the blood flow does not get into it as well as it did. Now, this is the channel through which the food goes in and down and swallows. It's responsible also for parts of our respiration and whether we feel calm and relaxed. So just from this picture, please understand how vital that front part of the throat where your dog could be pulling on a collar is, not only for behavior issues, but also for their long-term health. Now, here's a picture from a dog training site, learberg.com, and it says most aggressive dogs only need to have their front feet lifted off the ground a few times to realize that you can take their air away when you want. This is not painful for the dog. And I say, cool, let's try it on you, and then let's see if it's painful for the dog, because if it bothers you, it's going to bother the dog. Now, we just looked at the larynx. If you can see from this picture, right where that collar is right up at the larynx. You damage that, you're going to have stress in the rest of the body, and you're going to have eventually behavior issues or health issues. Let's look at the muscles, okay? First, we have the energy field, then we've got all the organs, then we've got the bones, then the organs interlay underneath, and now we have the muscles which cover the bones. The reason why this is important is because if you remember back from science class, the guy that like hung from the ceiling, you know, with the bone guy, now he couldn't go anywhere because he had no muscles attached to his bones to move him in any direction. He couldn't go anywhere because he had no muscles. But when you start adding muscles on top of the bones, you also have to be aware if certain muscles get tight or they go into any kind of spasm, those muscles are directly connected to all of those bones that we looked at. So a tight muscle could pull a bone out of place just enough. Now, doesn't mean you have to go to the veterinarian, doesn't mean that the dog is sick, but from an energetic level, the dog's body is having to reroute their energy, and after a while, that energy can actually build up and become an illness, or that energy, because the muscles are connected to the bones, and the bones innervate the nerves, and the nerves are connected to all of those organs, we could start to see behavior issues, emotional issues, because the nerves are not feeding the proper blood supply to those organs. And I have a background in studying Chinese medicine, so it gave me the awareness that everything is connected. So the body being out of balance can literally affect an organ, which is creating an issue in an emotion, or the dog can have an emotion that keeps getting exacerbated because the body's out of balance. So what I'm laying for you right now is the foundation of all of the layers of your dog's body. So we really do understand when I say that it's been my experience and my long-term research that bodies can absolutely affect behaviors. This is actually the base understanding and reason why. Now, you can see from here how these two puppies are pulling. If you do that for a long enough period of time, or that's the natural way of your walk, you can easily develop muscle imbalances, which are really not healthy for any system. You want the system acting and moving in as balanced of a way as possible. Because if an imbalance goes on for too long, it can actually create a problem. So you want to be noticing not to be creating any muscle imbalances in your dogs. And the same is true, you know, if your dog plays fetch, if your dog plays frisbee, if your dog goes on hikes or bike rides or skateboards with you. You just want to be aware that they are as balanced physically as possible, because again, muscle imbalances can create behavior issues. So as I mentioned, I studied traditional Chinese medicine, and I was a Western trained fitness trainer before that. And what TCM did for me is give me such a completely different awareness of how everything is connected, how the organs are connected, and those connect to emotions, and those connect to seasons, and those connect to senses and colors. So in understanding that the 5-element theory pretty much takes care of how the body is organized on a physical and emotional, psychological, and a spiritual level, it gave me a framework to be able to start to understand that the possibility exists that if something's going on with the dog's body, we could be seeing an emotional issue and a behavior issue. Now, this is a chart from Dr. Cheryl Schwartz's book, 4 Paws, 5 Directions. It is the TCM, the traditional Chinese medicine back alarm points. So when I work with an animal, I started kind of becoming aware that, like, well, if something's happening in the back, could it create a behavior? Because when Barney first had that first yank on his neck, I kind of noticed he started to become a little bit distant. He wasn't before that, but all of a sudden I was like, something feels like it disconnected, but I don't know what it is. Then when we had to start going through the nose halter and the prong collar and the shock collar and the harnesses, I really started to kind of have some kind of awareness formulating in the back of my mind. I wonder if bodies can affect behaviors the same way that they do in humans. So on a hunch, after I saw this chart, I started doing a very simple back assessment to every dog's back that I was working with to see, well, if this is true and these back alarm points will, you know, kind of trigger, like maybe the skin will flinch a little bit, or, you know, the dog will turn and look at me like, hey, that's a pain point. Well, these points can actually give me an awareness of what's happening at the different, as you can see on the left, you're seeing the different organs that I just showed you on the page before. I can start to understand, like from the lung, it's like, okay, the dog might be in grief. From the heart, the dog might be in an obsessive compulsive place where it can't regulate its state of joy. If something is happening in the liver, I would tend to see a dog that barks more. If something that was happening in the stomach or the spleen, I would start to see a dog that's more of a worrier. And if something was happening in the kidneys or the urinary bladder, I'd see a dog that was actually more fearful. Now, I didn't put all these pieces together fully till later on, and I'll show you that more in the chart of how I started connecting and understanding, wait a minute, like if these points are out in the back and these the behaviors that I'm seeing, if I actually check these back points and I do a simple muscle release technique to relieve the tension off the muscle, what I started seeing was the dogs would generally take a deep breath, and about 85 to 90% of their behavior would disappear. And it was fascinating because I was like, how can this be so simple But I kept seeing it over and over and over. And I was like, you know, this happens to be a missing link in dog training, because we're focusing on the behaviors, but not understanding you cannot have a behavior if you don't have a body. So maybe it's better to check the body first to see what's going on there. If it releases, if the tension in the muscle releases and the behavior shifts, well, it's not necessarily that the dog should be labeled with that behavior, but perhaps they were just out of balance, and that was what was creating the behavior. So that was really missing link discovery number one. As I started testing these points, I was like, wow, this is fascinating, because I'm not asking the dog to do anything. I'm just simply running my fingers down their back at every point. And that's included in my in-sync body awareness assessment. So I'll give you a link at the end of this presentation to that, so you can actually test your own dog's body. But this understanding that dogs' bodies are intimately connected to their behaviors changed my entire perspective around training, because instead of seeing a dog's behavior and labeling it right away, I started connecting, oh my goodness, so wait a minute. Depending on the area where I was seeing the stress in the back, that was telling me which organ it was connected to, and every organ has its own, it's like an emotional processing center. So I started to see when there was too much stress on the dog, whether it was happy or anxious. I'd see an overconfident dog that lacked boundaries. If I listened to their bark, you could tell whether it was happy stress or whether it was like stress. And as soon as I worked those mid-back points, it was almost like taking a cork out of a bottle. You know, the dog could breathe again, and then all of a sudden their behaviors just shifted back to most of their normal behaviors. And you know, the same was true when I checked the back points. If there was a heart issue at the back alarm point, I'd see an overexuberant or depressed dog, and you know, I'd either see obsession or aggressiveness. If the dog was a worrier, I'd sort of see like an overthinker. They'd usually be flighty and not grounded, or sort of have ADD or kind of be obsessive. And a lot of those dogs also had digestive issues. And if they were a lung dog and they were grief-stricken, and when I pressed the points on the back, it was correlated to the lung, I would literally see a dog that lacks oomph, that kind of takes on their owner's grief. Sometimes their coat is dull, or they had skin or nail issues. They'd often have weight gain, or they'd have arthritis. And if I was down in the kidney area and that was the issue, I'd see more of a fear-based dog, a dog who has more like separation anxiety, or, you know, they're having a hearing problem, or they kind of, you know, have a little bit of shaking going on, or submissive peeing, or when they laid down, they sighed. So this was fascinating to me because after I went through my fitness career, and after Barney had passed and I was living in Aspen, all of these pieces just started coming together, and I was like, wow, this is fascinating, because this is really like connecting the dots of what's really actually happening for the dogs. So then I started, you know, the next part of my journey was, all right, I'm understanding these awarenesses. I'm seeing this. I mean, I went through and tested almost 700 dogs, different breeds, different personalities, different ages, different, you know, constitutions, different behavior issues. But over and over and over, I kept seeing the same thing. If I tested the alarm points, and at those back alarm points, if I released the muscle tension, most of the behavior went away. And then we just did a little bit of retraining about, you know, boundaries and rules. But I would notice that when I released the muscle tension, there would be a corresponding deep breath taken by the dog. It was almost as if they had been holding their breath on a certain level, or breathing out of their sympathetic nervous system. And then all of a sudden, they could let go. They could take a much deeper breath, and the breath itself, because of how it's connected to the body, and if the body gets stressed or the body has any kind of trauma, and you know, the first thing that happens is this, and then we kind of hold that, but we start breathing on top of it, What I found was, my goodness, once you release the breath being stuck is what actually keeps the brain in a looping pattern. That's where you get your repetitive pattern behaviors. But if you get the body to take a deep breath, it will release that looping. And then all of a sudden, the dog can function back again at a much more normal awareness. So then I wanted to start understanding the research, like, you know, what are the veterinarians saying? What are other people saying? So I located a scientific study by behaviorist Anders Hallgren, who is in Sweden. And he had done a study on 400 dogs through like a dog club. And what they found, he had all the dogs go through a chiropractic assessment. And what they found was 63% of those 400 dogs had a neck or a spine issue. That was a subluxation in the spine or discomfort in the neck or the spine area. And out of those 78%, they found aggression and hyperactive behaviors in those dogs. Now, the interesting thing was the common thread in all of those was 91% of those dogs had strained against a leash. And I started looking at the physiology. I started looking at the back points. I started looking at, you know, what could potentially be happening in these dogs and what else can happen. And I started to realize, you know, that leash strain, if the neck is off balance or the back is off balance, that can actually also be at the root of fear or anxiety issues. And it can definitely be at the root of aggression issues, as Anders found. So I started realizing, you know, there's got to be a better way. I know from my experience with Barney that the tools that we're using are not working and they're not honoring the actual biomechanics and the actual physiology of the animals. So I meditate, and in meditation, I kept asking the universe, I said, can you please show me something that's going to help the dogs? And I got an awareness for a front clip harness. So that was the start of it. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if I had to go find one. I didn't know if I had to go make one. But I started just becoming aware that there's something else here about the dogs that I don't fully understand yet, about where they actually go out on instinct, but also where they easily come back into collecting themselves and being aware of the present moment. So this started me now researching some different veterinary aspects. So Dr. Karen Becker, who writes for McCullough.com, made a connection between collars and seizures. And she said cervical subluxation, like I showed you with the puppy, where the collar yanked on the atlas and C1, this can actually be the root of many seizures in dogs that are not necessarily for any other reason than if those bones get compromised a little more at a certain angle, it can be putting enough compression on the nerve that it's coming from the cervical vertebrae, not from food or anything else sometimes. So C1, she said cervical subluxation can also cause seizures, and this is something many pet owners don't realize. The C1 is the first cervical vertebrae in animals, and it articulates with the brainstem. When there is increased cerebrospinal fluid pressure in the brain stem, it can lead to seizure. So when the collar puts the atlas or C1 off of balance, it builds up cerebrospinal fluid. And that's how the seizure can happen. Too much pressure, and the dog can't move the energy through the head and back down through the neck because the cerebrospinal fluid to the head is being blocked off because there's an outage or an offage in the atlas or C1. That's how seizures can often happen. So she said, I see this type of seizure a lot in dogs that are chained outside. They run out the length of the chain chasing after a bunny, and when the chain snaps back against the neck, it causes a high cervical traumatic injury of either the C1 vertebrae, the atlas, or the C2, the axis. So she recommends a harness not only for walks, but if your dog is ever trained out. I recommend harnesses right from the get-go, because if your puppy's gonna pull backwards, think about, we have a little body, we have enough pressure to put out C1 or C2, and you won't notice it for a while. This is why I always recommend harnesses, because it's the most safe tool that respects your dog's body. And then in a little bit, we'll go into which tools are actually most effective. So that was one start that I started understanding the research of, like, oh, that's interesting. If C1, C2 can get shut off and then we have seizures, okay, that's one reason why we don't want to use collars for training. We can absolutely use collars for tags, but we don't want to clip anything to that collar. And this is Dr. Jean Dodds. Dr. Dodds is one of the foremost experts in the vaccine protocols. She is also a foremost expert in the thyroid gland and thyroid issues in dogs. Now, if you look at the picture next to her with that cute little boxer, I showed you the trachea before. Now you can see the butterfly gland, the butterfly-shaped gland of the thyroid that sits right at the base of your dog's neck. Now, where does your collar go? What is that collar doing if it's constantly putting pressure, either a flat collar or a choke chain or a prong collar? Where is it putting pressure? And especially on the thyroid gland, because the thyroid gland happens to be the gland that's the master gland for their dog's entire immune system. So we're talking, you can have skin issues, you can have allergy issues develop, you can have cancers develop, you can have, all kinds of organ functions can happen, blood issues can happen as a result of the thyroid being overtaxed. So again, if we just go back to total common sense and the science, plain and simple, you never really want to use a collar to walk or train your dog. And what Dr. Dodd said was, she recommends against choke or prong collars, as they can easily injure the delicate butterfly-shaped thyroid gland that sits just below the larynx and in front of the trachea. These collars can also cause injury to the salivary glands and the salivary lymph nodes on the side of the face underneath both ears. Now, here's a dog, we would think a flat collar is safer, but look at how much effort that dog is straining against. Okay, so that's not the place where we want to actually put pressure when we're looking to back a dog up. And again, all of these pieces can cause health and behavior issues. Flat collar issues, when you have consistent pulling, you can get neck strain, you can get jerking on the leash, which can pull a vertebrae out of alignment, which you wouldn't have known. You can have thyroid issues, and the opposition reflex is just telling you that the dog's body's starting to get off balance physically, and they have no possible way to fix it except to push more into the leash to keep their front feet on the floor. As we've seen so far, this is really why we don't want to have issues with putting a collar on and having the dog strain against the collar. So that was another piece of connecting the thyroid. Dr. Peter Tobias's information shared with me that collars can actually be at the root of some cancers. He said, for years I've observed the relationships between neck injuries and the health of dogs. I've learned that if the flow of energy is in the neck is interrupted or restricted, a whole array of problems may arise, including lameness, skin issues, allergies, lung and heart problems, digestive issues, ear and eye conditions. I also suspect that the patients that have severe energy flow congestion in the neck, probably from straining on the leash or jerking on the leash, have higher cancer rates. I cannot stress enough how important the health and alignment of the neck is to the general health of your dog. So this really started confirming what I was understanding, that the body of the dog being out of alignment can actually be at, and from what I've seen in my practice, is literally at the root of 85 to 90% of the dogs that I see. Because once I start doing that assessment down their back and we start releasing the tight muscles and we start releasing the constrictions and the restrictions that Dr. Tobias talks about, the dog's whole entire being shifts to one of being more relaxed. So aside from neck issues, we're also dealing with eye issues because all of these muscles, you know, when you strain enough, you're going to start tapping into the muscles, the deep muscles inside of the eyes. And this can happen with any type of collar. And most humans, trainers, and veterinarians are unfortunately not making the connection between pressure on the throat and eye issues later on down the line. Now, the problem is once these things happen or they're injured, they're not easy to reverse. So this is why I recommend harnesses, but I want to caution you too and just share with you about proper harness fit. The harness that you see on this dog, which clips at the front clip is a fantastic idea. But where this harness sits, it's actually restricting the dog's range of motion. And you never, ever want to use a harness that's going to limit movement. Because if you're limiting movement in the front, you're also going to be limiting movement in the back. And that will just lead to, oftentimes, what I've seen, earlier onset arthritises, tightnesses in the back. When the mobility shuts down a little bit, the dogs also, their behaviors can change. They feel stiffer, so they're more guarded. So, you know, when their bodies are soft and flexible and pliable, they're fine. But imagine a dog coming in to another dog that's got tightness in their back, and the dog that has the tightness in their back doesn't want that dog to recognize it, and then they go and snap, and then they're labeled as aggressive. Most of the times from what I see, I don't see a lot of aggressive dogs. I see aggressive behaviors, but once we test the back points and release the muscle tension, then I've got a dog that is not an aggressive dog. I had a dog that was in protective mode because their body was out of balance. The other thing that I don't like about this harness is it hobbles the dog. So any kind of harness that fits this way, I would never recommend using it, and I absolutely would never recommend using it for any type of exercise, even for walks. Because even if your dog's going at a slow pace, with limited shoulder movement and restriction, that is like counterproductive. I would also never recommend it for puppies because puppies have growth plates, and you never ever want to get in the way of that. You want a harness that comes down the center of the neck, goes between the legs and up behind the shoulder blades. So you've got free range of movement. And as I'll show you in a moment, what I discovered about the collection point for the dogs. The other thing with this harness, it can also, when the dog resists, it starts pulling the dog's shoulders forward, which is also never anything that's really good for your dog. And with this type of harness, your dog can also escape out of it. The way that it fits. And if it's too big or like it's sagging, I've seen dogs walking around with the harness all the way down here, and you know, they're kind of like shuffling along, but your dog a lot of times can easily step out of them. So as I mentioned too, with the restrictions of those harnesses, you could also see down the road issues, because you don't realize if you start limiting shoulder motion, you could be stiffening up the neck, you could be affecting cervical vertebrae, and you could see down the road issues that are actually stemming from the top part of the spine, but everything's connected. So they can travel down to the back end of the spine, and they can shut down the back end of the body just from an issue, you know, at the higher part of the spine. So when we look at proper training tool fit, you can see on the left where the collar will squeeze and restrict many muscles and the cervical vertebrae. From the harness picture in the front, what you're going to see is that the harness should go on the sides of the dog's neck where there's only muscle and the bones are not affected. And then where the harness clip should be placed is right at the chest point, okay? Once the dog feels pressure at the chest point, dogs were designed to pull away from things. That's why back clip harnesses aren't so effective, because the dogs can engage their front legs, which puts them in instinct, and it takes a while for them to kind of realize to come out of instinct. When you clip the point at the chest, what I discovered was it's the actual collection point for the dog. Dogs don't like to push through things. So if the dog is pushing and it can't activate its front legs, within a very short period of time of it realizing that it's not moving forward, it's going to start sort of looking around because now it's aware of its body. Because remember, when your dog's in instinct, they're not really aware of their body. They're aware of what's out there that they want to chase or get. When a dog is connected to their body and the body can't go forward, they actually have to start changing their brain, and they start backing off pressure, and then they start kind of looking at their human to say, okay, well, what do you need me to do for us to go forward? You can see from the picture on the right of the harness on the side, there's also no restriction with this type of harness in the shoulder area. Okay, so it's safe for puppies, it's safe for exercising, it's safe for sleeping, it's safe for riding in the car. So there really is a difference in different harnesses and how they fit and how they were designed. So I want you to know that and think about that when you're getting your tools. So here's a case study of pulling all of these pieces together. This is Maximilian. He was a 3-year-old Belgian Shepherd, lovely couple, two ladies who had just had a baby about 8 months before, and they loved this dog. He was highly trained. He had been to 7 different trainers. He was Schutzen trained. He was, Max knew every single command there was. The problem was that when he went, when they started walking the baby in the stroller, he started acting and behaving highly aggressive, and they were scared because should he get off the leash, they were afraid he could do some damage. So they were ready to surrender him to the animal shelter. So the animal shelter called me and asked me, do you have any recommendations? I said, well, let me go meet the dog and let me see what happens. So I met him, and he really was a lovely, lovely dog. And we went outside and I saw the aggression, and I said, I would like to work with this dog for a week before he goes into the shelter, because I suspect that there's something going on deeper with what had happened, with him. Now, the dog had been trained with choke collars, prong collars, shock collars, Schutzen trained. A lot of the times they'll do a throat chop to the dog's throat, which I do not understand, because A, it hurts, but B, do you understand the delicate nature of what's in the dog? So brought him home, and again, he was lovely behaved. And immediately I called my chiropractor and I said, could you please come and see us, because I want to get this dog checked. And it was interesting. I didn't realize it till I had asked the dog to sit for the chiropractor when the chiropractor came next day, but it took Max almost 45 seconds to sit down. And it wasn't that he did not know how to sit down, but as I started watching him, I was like, oh my goodness, you are actually uncomfortable. And I had known it a little bit because I had checked his back points and I knew there were certain things out, but I hadn't paid as much attention to his body physiology when I first met him, just because he was so big and that concern about keeping him safe and other being safe. As soon as the chiropractor adjusted Max, and there were 5 adjustments on his back, I said, Max, sit. 5 seconds. Max sat right down. And I was kind of blown away, because I was like, it's true. It's like, you're really not an aggressive dog, are you? You've just been in pain. And I never saw Max from that day and me having him for a week. I never saw him exhibit that wild, aggressive behavior again. And he went back to the shelter for just a couple of days, and he was adopted by a lovely family who had had 5 previous shepherds. So they were really familiar with the breed, and Max lived out a great life till he was 11 years old. Now, his parents, his original owners, had said, we don't know what to do. We've been thinking even maybe we need to put him down. So this is a common thing I see when behaviors are not able to be changed by foods or by, typical training methods, because you have to understand that the dog might have pain or discomfort in their back. So that's what's actually creating the behavior. You can't override it till you fix what's at the root, which is the body. So this connected with, like, the first discovery of understanding bodies and behaviors are connected really got me. Then I started to realize that collection point, because one of the things I did with Max was I took him off a collar and I put him on the walk and sink harness. And Ayana here is wearing the walk and sink harness. So you can see the clip is right at the chest. It's a totally open shoulder. So the fit is super duper important, because this really, you want the dog, if they're going to have any pressure, if they walk into pressure, you want them to just have a slight pressure at the chest, because they will quickly start to back off of pressure, because they don't like to push into pressure. They like to pull away from it. So understanding that this collection point at the chest made so much sense, I landed up developing a leash that would create a shorter amount of space for that pressure to be created. I started to understand from physics, okay, well, the longer something goes out on a fulcrum, the more energy you have to use to bring it back. So like when a dog's on a 6-foot leash, you got to use a lot more energy, because they're creating so much torque from pushing into, the pressure. They're trying to pull away, in their perspective. They're trying to pull away from the pressure that's behind them. So what I started to realize was, if the pressure's here and we shorten up the distance of that fulcrum, as you can see in my hands, how I'm holding the leash, there's 2 flat rubber leash handles. So at 2.5 feet, a dog really can't produce a tremendous amount of torque. And they start to understand quickly, okay, there's pressure at my chest, nobody's going forward. All right, maybe I have to change my behavior. So the optimal was to create a harness and leash system that worked together, so the human is calm and relaxed, because if any of you have had a dog that pulls really hard and you have gotten leash burn, you know it is no joke. It hurts so much. And then it makes you feel uncomfortable and unsafe about going to walk your dog again, because your body had experienced pain. So putting these flat handles there ensures that there's a set clear distance, that your dog cannot pull you off of balance, and also from following a correct biomechanical structure for the harness, the dog also can't pull their body mechanics off of balance. So this whole journey with Barney really led me to creating the walk and sink harness and leash system to fulfill my promise of creating a respectful harness or tool. I didn't know it was going to be a harness, but it was creating a respectful tool that would never harm the dog's body, and also a way to vastly improve communication. So when the dog is wearing the harness and the human has the leash with the proper consistent boundaries, it rebalances dogs' behaviors very, very quickly. It's very body-centered. But I want you to understand that you've got 2 pieces. One piece is making sure the dog's body is aligned properly, that there's no outages in the neck or the back or the throat. And the second piece is using tools that are highly respectful and clearly communicate to your dog exactly what you're asking for. If your dog is pulling and you're pulling back, it's not really clearly communicating with your dog, because your dog's trying to pull away from pressure, even though it's counterintuitive. When your dog goes to push into pressure and you stop and stand still, and you've got clear boundaries that are not going to change, your dog will start to change the process and recognize, oh, you're in charge? Okay, what did you want me to? Oh, you want me to back up? And you don't have to even do any of that with a treat. So this is what I wanted to share with you about the missing link discovery, that bodies are definitely connected to behaviors and behavior issues. And also there is a clear, consistent collection point for your dog that will help you in training. And this can be at any age, whether it's a puppy or you've got a 12-year-old puller. The dogs understand their physical bodies really well. We just have to make sure we're in the right place to communicate and connect with their bodies properly. So the whole point of this was that when I started training Barney, I didn't understand about harnessing his energy. I just was trying to fix his behaviors. But when I layered in through my journey all of the different things that I was being shown between traditional Chinese medicine and the back points, and then understanding the physiology, and then understanding like it doesn't take a lot of pressure to back off an energy, you just have to be in the right place for it. The main reason for all of this was obviously I ended up hurting my dog physically, which devastated me. So the first thing I wanted to make sure when I created this harness and leash system was it has to be safety first, and there can never be any choking. The second point was, is our communication clear? Do I have to give the dog treats? Is it simple? Does the dog understand it? Like when I do 3 simple things, is the dog changing their behavior, and are they reading the signals of the tools, and is it the proper communication for them and for me? What I started to realize was, you know, we want to drain our dog's energy, but actually we don't really want to drain it. We want to train it in a way that we engage the energy, but it focuses the mind and the body together. So if you're throwing the ball, throwing the ball, throwing the ball, throwing the frisbee, throwing the frisbee, throwing the frisbee, running the dog, running the dog, running the dog, it'll drain their energy. But it really doesn't activate the connection of the mind-body. So when you are in a proper harness and leash, what I found through Walk and Sync is it is so much easier for the dogs to start to collect themselves when the body is in the proper place and it's safe. The mind can engage with it. And then you have like a really aware dog that understands their neutral gear, that you're not having to try and get them to figure it out. They naturally understand it. You just have to understand, how do the tools work properly? And where do the tools go to help the dog understand what you're actually wanting them to know? The other thing that happened that I started to notice as a result of this, of watching the dogs and their bodies, but also watching the human energy totally changed from, you know, the wrapping their leash and being fearful to just being calm and relaxed. And when that happens on one end of the leash, that actually transfers down to the other end of the leash. And if there's anything that I've learned from dog training, energy really matters. So if you can be a great leader on your end of the leash because you feel safe and secure that the tools that you're using are correct and they're correcting the problem, you end up being a great leader to your dog. And the one last thing that I found out about harnessing your dog's energy is because of the back and because of the neck, I generally recommend a chiropractic adjustment at least twice a year for puppies. And I recommend it 3 times a year for larger breed puppies. And then I would just say even once a year, if you get your dog adjusted, it won't, if anything is off balance, because remember, our dogs are running around, they're puppies, they're stumbling, they're tripping, they're banging into each other, they're banging into other things, they're falling off things, they miss the stuff in the car. You know, all of those things can actually also contribute. You know, they're in the snow and they post hole and it doesn't seem like a big deal, like nothing's broken, but I always recommend a chiropractic adjustment or doing some body work for them just to make sure that there's no tension on the spine. So all of this just simply has to do with one thing, and it's starting out on the right paw and making sure that we understand what's really taking place on the inside of our animals so that we're aware of when we see things manifesting on the outside, like behavior issues or even health issues, we can actually take this back to a base level of getting our dogs' bodies in the right alignment, and also using tools that will help their body stay in sync, and also using tools that will help us stay in sync with each other. So this is, you know, the bigger purpose of that is to make the world safer for all dogs. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. This has really been my journey with my own dog and then becoming a professional holistic dog trainer and communicator and body worker, and understanding the depth of the level of the actual physiology and the biomechanics and how that actually affects dogs' behavior. So if you have any questions or you'd like to contact me, you can check out animalhealer.com. And I offer animal communication sessions, health, behavior, medical intuitive, or when it's that time, consultations. If you would like to get a walk and sync system, the harness and leash for your dog, please visit walkandsync.com, and please use the check out, I have a missing link ebook. It's a 60-page ebook that I wrote that covers all of this in much deeper depth, so that you really understand what's taking place. And you can use the discount code AWSTML18 as my free gift to you. And for upcoming online training courses, or to learn more about my InSync body assessment courses and body protocol courses, please join our mailing list at walkansync.com. And I will also be, if you want to contact me directly, that would be info@dogwalkinsync.com, and I can send you the email for the InSync body assessment. So you can check that out, and you can check out whether or not your dog has some, just undiscovered pains or restrictions in their back, which will absolutely start to make a difference in shifting their behavior. My name is Allecia Evans. I'm the animal healer. Thank you so much for taking time to watch this presentation. And I wish for you and your dog to walk in sync and have great health together.